collects testimonies of discrimination and human rights violation affecting religious or belief communities in order to disseminate them to international bodies and in order to raise awareness and inform them as well as to generate debate on the protection of religion and belief. Freedom of religion is an essential right enshrined in a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Freedom of religion goes hand in hand with freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, and is also enshrined to the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the right of human dignity. For more than 20 years, we have been denouncing the forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong members and now of other religious and ethnic minorities. On 14 June, UN experts expressed their concern about forced organ harvesting in China. I quote, "Forced organ harvesting in China appears to target specific ethnic, linguistic, or religious minorities, dating Falun Gong practitioners, Uyghurs, Tibetan, Muslim, and Christians, often without explanation of the reason for their arrest or the issuance of an arrest warrant in different locations. We are deeply concerned about reports of discriminatory treatment of prisoners or detainees based on their ethnicity and religion or belief. We join the UN experts who, in their conclusion, I quote, call on China to promptly respond to the allegation of organ harvesting and to allow independent monitoring by international human rights mechanisms." Now, I would like to introduce Dr. Harold King, Deputy Director of Dr. Against Forced Organ Harvesting, who will be co-moderating this event with me this afternoon. Please, welcome Dr. Harold King.
Thank you, Thierry. Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting is honored to co-organize this side event to the United Nations Human Rights Council with CAP Liberté de Conscience to bring to the international stage these ongoing crimes against humanity. The egregious crimes of forced organ harvesting from living Falun Gong practitioners has been occurring for over 2 decades in the People's Republic of China. Irrefutable evidence has been gathered and led to a unanimous judgment in 2019 by the China Tribunal chaired by Sir Geoffrey Nice. On 14th of June 2021, the United Nations published a statement co-signed by 12 United Nations special rapporteurs and experts reflecting concerns about forced organ harvesting. In September 2021, a coalition of NGOs organized the World Summit on combating and preventing forced organ harvesting, after which a universal declaration on combating and preventing forced organ harvesting was launched. From 2012 to 2018, Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting conducted an informal global petition to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and collected over 3 million signatures. The vast support from around the world showed that many people follow this topic and seek answers. After hearing all these initiatives, I think it is appropriate to say that it is time for the international community to take on these crimes against humanity and stop the state-sponsored forced organ harvesting in China before it is too late.
I would like now to welcome our distinguished speakers and our audience watching the live stream broadcast via NTD TV and Epoch Times TV platform. Thank you all for joining us today. Before we begin, I will describe today's event. Our panel of speakers is composed by experts in the field of forced organ harvesting and human rights. For those speakers who wish to speak in their mother language, we will provide an English translation that will simultaneously scroll up in the side during their speech. We would also like to remind our viewers that we will have a roundtable discussion tomorrow, followed by question and answer session. We would like to encourage you to write down any question that you might have by listening our speakers today, so that you can submit them tomorrow during our roundtable discussion. After listening to the experts today, We will discuss tomorrow how we can find solutions to end this crime against humanity. Let us now hear from our distinguished speakers. Our first speaker will be Dr. Thorsten Trey, Executive Director of Doctor Against Forced Organ Harvesting. Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Thorsten Trey.
Good afternoon. Let me begin by thanking CAP Liberté de Conscience for organizing this important side event to the 49th session of the UN Human Rights Council. It is with honor, but also with sadness, that I speak today in memory of the countless victims who were killed for their organs. While we mourn the people who are losing their lives in senseless wars, we have to realize that we have failed to mourn the people who lose their lives due to forced organ harvesting in concealed hospitals and detention camps. Over the past 23 years, an undisclosed number of Falun Gong practitioners, probably more than 1 million people, were killed for their organs in China. Yet have we mourned for them? Is the direction advocacy in human rights takes simply dependent on the public attention generated by social media and news reports? Everyone is now rightfully shocked to watch the human tragedy and the loss of human lives in the Ukraine. But how would we react if we saw all of the hundreds of thousands of people being organ harvested in China on social media and TV? Then why do we gather here today? Because we believe in the potential of humankind and in the basic rights of human beings. Human rights advocacy is to engage for those who are not in the position to advocate for themselves and for their own rights. Human rights advocacy gives a voice to those whose God-given rights have been stolen. In the field of human rights violations, cameras, media reports, and human rights organizations play an important role. They can divert attention and, by staying silent and failing to report on the crimes, can disguise a human tragedy and even make it disappear. Conversely, they can bring these crimes to the main media stage. Thus, we have to remind ourselves that the God-given rights that come with our human existence must not be obscured by disinformation, cover-ups, or silence. Then let us take a deeper look at the practice of forced organ harvesting. In 2006, independent witnesses came forward publicly and reported that organs were harvested from living Falun Gong practitioners. How did it come to this point? In 1999, the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, Jiang Zemin, initiated a brutal persecution against Falun Gong practitioners for the single reason that they are good, kind-hearted and honest people. They live by the principles of truthfulness, compassion and forbearance and practice peaceful, Qigong-like exercises in their daily lives for their spiritual enrichment, personal improvement and health. In other words, Falun Gong represents what the whole world so desperately needs today. Let me say this in a different way. In China, living people who strive to be kind and tolerant are being killed for their organs. If one does not have a gut-wrenching, visceral reaction at this point, then one has not comprehended the horror and terror that Falun Gong practitioners are living through every day. Living prisoners of conscience just wait in dread for the day when their organs and blood type match the needs of a patient who seeks and pays for a transplant organ. China has successfully deceived the international community in making the world believe that it has an ethical transplant system. It has become the largest transplant market without having a transparent organ donation program and without meeting the criteria of the guiding principles on organ donation and transplantation set forth by the World Health Organization. Investigators have shown that the Chinese transplant market is heavily based on payments for organs and lacks transparency and traceability. For the past 16 years, various groups of investigators and researchers have gathered overwhelming evidence about the Chinese transplant system and forced organ harvesting. The conclusion of forced organ harvesting in China is mostly based on 3 major areas. Implausible and excessive transplant numbers combined with a vast expansion of the transplant infrastructure. Implausible and manufactured organ donation numbers. A plethora of eyewitness reports, both from Falun Gong practitioners and non-Falun Gong practitioners. When combined, these 3 areas show beyond any reasonable doubt that the main source of organs for China's transplant market are Falun Gong practitioners. This has been extensively reviewed, examined and concluded in 2019 by the China Tribunal, chaired by Sir Geoffrey Nice. Let me put these findings in a different perspective. The Chinese government has clandestinely delegated the executions of Falun Gong practitioners from courthouses to hospitals, has successfully established a self-propelling execution machine that maintains itself through a profitable transplant market. The killing of prisoners of conscience is now covered up as a medical charity practice. Transplantors might not be aware of this mechanism and are dragged into complicity with these crimes against humanity by signing up and paying for a transplant operation. By allowing transplantors to come to China, a new unprecedented level of evil has been reached, as the perpetrators of this co-genocide have channeled people from around the world to participate in the eradication of Falun Gong practitioners. Whenever a transplantor demands a transplant organ, the process of killing a Falun Gong practitioner for the organs is set into motion. I'm asking everyone, do Falun Gong practitioners not deserve the same level of attention and support as other victims of human rights violations? We have established that the presence or absence of cameras and news media has a significant influence on the response to human rights violations. Another aspect of our inaction might be that we don't know enough or misunderstand the victims. Please allow me to round up my talk by briefly describing again what Falun Gong practitioners aspire to and stand for. Falun Gong practitioners simply want to improve themselves in their spiritual life. They simply ask for the freedom and right to practice their spiritual practice. They are kind-hearted and compassionate members of our societies. They are the bedrock of goodness in today's world of arguments, wars and lies. Humankind exists with a mission and has a meaning. In your heart, you know what your mission is. By speaking up for Falun Gong, you not only help goodness to win in today's world, but you also reconnect to your original mission in life, reconnect to your original motive that made you choose to engage in the field of human rights. Let me refer again to the camera. A camera is a device that has an aperture that allows light to enter a dark chamber. Either literally or figuratively, we need the same light to enter the dark chambers where organs are being forcibly harvested from Falun Gong practitioners and other prisoners of conscience in China. We need independent inspectors from the United Nations who, like the light in the camera, enter the dark chambers where the forced organ harvesting occurs. I'm not here to instruct others in what to do. I'm just here to say that one has to make a choice, whether one likes it or not. Some might wish to avoid getting involved, yet that does not work. If one chooses not to row, the river will carry the boat downstream. Silence is not neutral. Silence allows forced organ harvesting to continue. Silence is a missed opportunity. Silence means that one has decided not to actively choose goodness. By persecuting Falun Gong for over 2 decades, the Chinese government has pursued a genocide against goodness in humankind. However, as long as we are free to make a choice and break the silence. So, what do we choose? To make a true statement. By advocating for Falun Gong, you actually advocate for yourself and for your own good future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Trey, for reminding us that we should not follow the easy and convenient path when speaking about human rights violations, but that we should choose a principled approach when defending the basic rights of every human being. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Declan Lyons, Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Trinity College Medical University in Dublin, Ireland. He provides us with his professional analysis of the persecution of Falun Gong and forced organ harvesting in China from the point of view of the victims. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Declan Lyons.
Thank you for the invitation to address this meeting on the topic of the cold and calculated genocidal campaign which has been underway against members of the Falun Gong movement in China for well over 2 decades. My name is Declan Lyons. I'm a psychiatrist and medical doctor from Dublin, Ireland, and I wish to draw the attention of the meeting today to an aspect of the brutal crackdown that shames and assaults us all, and which we may find barely credible, such as the horror of the violation against the person and the human body that we will hear about. I have spoken out against the persecution of Falun Gong shortly after the start of the Chinese Communist Party's onslaught against its own defenceless citizens in 1999. I was initially appalled to learn that Falun Gong practitioners were subject to incarceration in psychiatric hospitals and forced to endure torture and physical and psychological mutilation in an attempt to force them to renounce their beliefs in the core principles of truthfulness, compassion and forbearance. I was not alone in condemning this crusade of savagery against defenceless spiritual observers. All the professional bodies that I have held membership of, including the World Psychiatric Association, have spoken out against the misuse of psychiatric diagnosis and politically repressive psychiatry which labels dissent as mental illness. And we have been here before. The Soviet Union was well versed in falsely diagnosing political dissidents with severe mental illness and subjecting people to involuntary treatment in custodial mental asylums. Chinese forensic psychiatrists have been expertly taught by their Russian counterparts to force such interventions as electroconvulsive treatment, painful acupuncture and injectable antipsychotic drugs without any genuine clinical indication, effectively rendering anyone who spoke out against the persecution of Falun Gong to be a candidate for a chemical straitjacket. A new frontier of the perversion and corruption of the basic tenets of medical ethics was therefore well on the way to being opened up. The principle that medical skills should only be deployed for the improvement of life and health is summed up in the Hippocratic injunction, "First do no harm." Sadly, in the People's Republic, we have seen the pressing of some Chinese doctors to unethically deploy their skills for state-directed purposes of political and religious repression. This means, however, that the entire medical profession is at risk of being politically corrupted. By far the most sinister dimension to the persecution, however, has been the assertion that Falun Gong practitioners have become a source of human organs to be transplanted into paying patients from abroad who travel to China in search of a kidney, a liver, a heart or a cornea. It has been well acknowledged that executed prisoners have provided a steady supply of organs for harvesting and transplant for many years. But the actual number of transplants at 60,000 to 100,000 per year, often taking place at military hospitals, far exceeds the number available through execution or voluntary post-mortem donation. Forced organ harvesting is removal of a person's organs for the purpose of transplantation while the person is still alive, murdering the victim in the process. It is a process that kills victims on demand and is extremely lucrative, with a potential return on each body with usable organs, totaling up to $500,000. If the suspected Falun Gong practitioners, who are generally in a good state of physical health, are the primary source of these organs and account for the discrepancy between any potential sources of organ donation and the actual transplants that occur, then this must represent the most deliberate eradication campaign ever undertaken against a religious group since the Holocaust. Can you imagine the trauma and anxiety of clinging to life within the labour camp system in China, knowing that your very existence is in peril, as at any moment your body parts could be extracted and sold to the highest bidder on the international organ donor market? Transplantation is always undertaken with the objective of improving patient survival, and society rightly valorises those who donate organs voluntarily in life or who bequeath them to a stranger in need after death. The evidence for the widespread practice of forcible extraction of organs from prisoners of conscience you will have already heard. I do not need to repeat this. Why, you may ask, does the world and some in the Chinese medical community and some in the medical profession elsewhere choose to avert their eyes from this atrocity? Why is this cruelty institutionalized and normalized and existing on such a scale that it seems easier and more convenient to dismiss as speculation and rumour or even xenophobic propaganda? The answer lies in the indifference and apathy of bystanders to cruelty, that they feel does not directly inconvenience them or impact on their daily lives. This is all a political system that has no moral compass, needs to perpetrate terror and savagery on its own citizens, and history is full examples of this today and yesterday. Aided by the perversion of science and technology, and comforted by censorship and narrowed access to free reporting, regimes are free to revel in corruption, brutality and horror. All the while, citizens, such as Falun Gong practitioners, suffer and agonize, knowing that just for expressing their spiritual beliefs, they run the risk of not just arrest, detention and torture, but also slave labour and disappearance, and organ evisceration. If they are ever released having survived this massive organised violence, they are dehumanised, traumatised, and permanently vulnerable to major depression, anxiety and suicide, as I have personally witnessed. If deliberate and planned medical killing remains unprohibited, then who can be trusted within the medical community to deliver care when it's subsequently needed? Yet, we have seen that unacceptable breaches of human rights are being confronted today in Ukraine, for example. These violations are unacceptable globally, unacceptable to governments, citizens, corporations, athletes and artists who have boycotted and isolated the Russian state in a massive and spontaneous wave of condemnation. Deliberate acts of genocide are becoming difficult to conceal in an era of portable media platforms. Yet we need to do much more elsewhere, and especially in China. Medics everywhere need to become aware of atrocities perpetrated by our Chinese counterparts and should embargo cooperation, research and academic partnership with Chinese transplantation services, as many have already done. We call on the Chinese authorities to allow inspection of their transplant facilities, open transplant registers and reform the military hospital system. We should have a dialogue with our Chinese counterparts about the iniquities within our own health systems, which indeed are far from perfect. But to allow this conversation to even begin, there must be an immediate end to unethical transplantation practices and the gross obscenity of plundering organs to sell to the highest bidder. We call on the UN to investigate these concerns and collectively demand that an immediate end is put to the horrendous practice of forced organ harvesting in China, which is one of the permanent members of its Security Council. The cancellation of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline shows, in my view, that people are willing to advocate for human rights in other nations, and even in this interconnected world, to pay a price for this and to open their homes and hearts to those fleeing persecution. Let us sound the alarm for human rights once again, as we see that the Chinese Revolution is unfinished and that another long march is required so that China will no longer demonize, persecute or tyrannize its own citizens. Only then will it be a nation of wisdom and a worthy home to Falun Gong, one of the great spiritual movements of the 20th century. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Lyons, for your strong analysis and reminder that medicine must never be used to political or ideological objectives, as this can easily lead to medical profession to become absurd. Once ethical standards in medicine are violated, the profession becomes abused and destroys the patient confidence. Now, I would like to welcome Mr. Herman Terch from Spain. Mr. Terch is a member of the European Parliament and a committed defender of human life and traditional values. He is strongly opposed to forced organ harvesting. Mr. Terch will speak in Spanish, and you will find an English translation of his speech in a side panel. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Herman Terch.
Estimados amigos de la conferencia de Davos, que se celebra al mismo tiempo que la 49 Conferencia de Derechos Humanos de las Naciones Unidas. Soy Herman Terch, desde Bruselas, soy parlamentario en el Parlamento de Europa para el partido Vox de España. Y quiero mandar desde aquí, como digo, un saludo y un fuerte abrazo en este nuevo esfuerzo por denunciar una de las mayores monstruosidades que se producen día a día en nuestro mundo y que no son suficientemente denunciadas precisamente por los enormes intereses políticos y económicos que hay detrás de la denuncia. Porque debemos denunciar lo que es la extracción, nada menos que la extracción y el trasplante forzoso de órganos a personas privadas de libertad, qué es lo que se produce con una frecuencia también monstruosa en la República Popular China. Debemos denunciar al régimen comunista de Pekín, que es el que practica estas terribles operaciones para mayor lucro propio y utilizando a presos de conciencia, persecución religiosa y víctimas, otras víctimas del inmenso aparato represivo de la República Popular Comunista China. Debemos pedir una vez más al Comité de Derechos Humanos de las Naciones Unidas que levante la voz contra este crimen continuado que se produce ante los ojos de todos en la República Popular China y que no se denuncia nunca con la intensidad, con la fuerza, con la vehemencia y con la indignación que merece este terrible crimen permanente. Muchas gracias a todos, un saludo y muchísimo éxito en sus deliberaciones.
Thank you, Mr. Turch, for your unwavering support and commitment to speak up against the crime of forced organ harvesting. Next, I would like to introduce Madame Zsuzsanna Georgieva. As a journalist, editor, and a host on Bulgarian national television and radio, she analyzes the daily news from a philosophical and traditional perspective. Madame Georgieva will speak in Bulgarian, and you will find an English translation of her speech on the side panel. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Madame Zsuzsanna Georgieva.
Много е тъжно, когато една такава велика цивилизация, каквато е китайската, с нейната духовност и култура. Това е Китай, наследника на Лао Цзъ, на Конфуций, велики мислители, духовни водачи, е обект на осъждане. Защото това е държавата, в която се регистрират чудовищни престъпления спрямо човека, спрямо неговото тяло и суверенитет и спрямо духа и неговото мислене и свобода. Говорим за не много популярното, за съжаление, не много популярния факт, за съжаление, какъвто е трансплантацията на органи от живи хора. Няма нищо лошо в трансплантацията. Това е велико достижение на човека, човешкия дух и човешкото знание. Но когато това се случва без знанието на хората, без тяхното съгласие, когато са живи и здрави и се прави върху хора, които дори не знаят, че техният живот се дължи на престъпление, е ужасяващо според мен. И не знам какво трябва да направят световните организации, ООН и другите, които защитават човешките права и човешката полета на човешкия дух. Просто не знам какво трябва да направи, за да се спре този кошмар. Жалко е също така, че Китай вместо да развие духовността на своите предци, стига до такова падение, но това според мен се дължи на доктрината, идеологическата доктрина, която изповядва именно комунизма. Там в комунистическата идеология няма човешкия живот, не е ценност. И това го знае света. Знаят го всички. И днес се бориме срещу тази доктрина, но за съжаление, пак казвам, вируса на комунизма е един от най-силните, един от най-могъщите. Убива така човешкия дух, както спина убива човешкото тяло. Когато съм мислила по тази тема и по този факт, защото това е факт достатъчно известен вече на широката общественост, пред трансплантацията на органи от живи хора, взети от живи хора, здрави, млади. И се чудя, ако ние разчупим своя материалистичен мироглед и влезем в контекста на духовното, т.е. на вечността на живота и на живота на духа, и си мисля, че тези хора, на които им трансплантират откраднати, незаконно откраднати органи от живи човешки същества, чието съдби са прехършени, нима тези хора не биха поели върху себе си тежка карма. И много е странно, може би и не е странно, че обект на преследване от страна на Комунистическата партия е именно Фалун Дафа. Едно учение, което пропагандира, проповядва и лансира високите човешки ценности и морал, като свобода, като съпричастие, като съзидание. Истинските наследници, както казах вече, на Лао Цзэ и на Конфуций. Не знам има ли спасение. Не знам дали има спасение. Има, според мен, тогава, когато хората се обединят, тогава, когато имат информация, тогава, когато институциите, организациите, световните не си затварят очите или ги притварят. ООН е като организация, която защитава човешките права и правото на всеки човек да изповядва своите възгледи, своите убеждения, да живее щастливо, правото му на щастие, санкционира китайската държава, но вероятно не така, както трябва и не толкова, колкото трябва. Аз не знам как трябва да се случи това и какво трябва да се направи. Нали за това сме ги делегирали там хората, умните, знаещите да го направят, но трябва да го направят. Тази практика трябва да спре. Трябва, защото е петно и срам за човека и човешкия род.
Thank you, Mrs. Georgieva, for your touching speech. You remind us the tragedy that unfolded in a Chinese story that saw the cultural aids of Lao Tzu and Confucius and the dark side of communist and forced organ harvesting. Now, I would like to introduce Mr. Carlos Iglesias, a renowned international human rights lawyer who was the first lawyer who successfully sued a leader of the CCP for genocide of Falun Gong practitioners. Mr. Iglesias has testified about the persecution of Falun Gong at the UN Human Rights Council. He will speak in Spanish, and you will find an English translation of his speech on the side panel. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Carlos Iglesias.
Hace más de 2 décadas que el Partido Comunista Chino está persiguiendo a su propio pueblo, torturando y asesinando a personas inocentes por sus creencias, por sus valores. El crimen de sustracción forzada de órganos es posiblemente uno de los mayores crímenes cometidos contra la humanidad. Y nadie que conozca el funcionamiento del sistema chino puede ignorar que cualquier situación que se produzca en los hospitales, sean públicos o militares chinos, están controlados absolutamente por el Partido Comunista Chino. El propio Partido Comunista Chino lanzó el 20 de julio una de las más terribles persecuciones que ha conocido el ser humano. Millones de personas son perseguidas por sus valores, por su fe, por sus creencias. Los practicantes de Falun Gong. Pero no solamente ellos, cristianos, tibetanos, uigures, están siendo el objetivo claro del Partido Comunista Chino. ¿Para conseguir qué? Erradicarlos, eliminarlos físicamente. Pero fueron más allá y pensaron, ¿por qué no enriquecernos de una manera corrupta, sangrienta, con el sufrimiento de estas personas? Y surge entonces la sustracción forzada de órganos, este crimen terrible, donde las personas son utilizadas como banco de órganos vivos. Esto lleva ininterrumpidamente realizándose en China durante más de 2 décadas y continúa hasta el día de hoy. Tenemos que darnos cuenta que hay 2 fechas absolutamente significativas en la historia del Partido Comunista Chino. Una, un 20 de julio de 1949, que firma la Convención para prevenir y sancionar el delito de genocidio. Y otra misma fecha, exactamente 50 años después, el mismo día, 50 años después, otro 20 de julio de 1999, lanza lo que posiblemente es calificado como el mayor crimen de la historia de la humanidad. no solo por el número de millones de personas afectadas, sino por la crueldad utilizada. El 20 de julio de 1999 se lanza una persecución contra el movimiento espiritual Falun Gong. Entre 70, 80, 90 millones de chinos, ciudadanos inocentes, y también cristianos, tibetanos, uigures, musulmanes, persiguiéndolos no solamente por motivos espirituales o religiosos, sino también raciales, étnicos, en definitiva lo que comporta un delito de genocidio. 50 años después de la firma del Partido Comunista Chino, el propio Partido Comunista Chino está llevando a cabo el mayor genocidio de la historia de la humanidad. Y yo me dirijo a cualquier persona que tenga un cargo, una representatividad en Naciones Unidas. Pero no me dirijo en función de su cargo, me dirijo directamente a su corazón, para que vea directamente lo que es correcto. A veces no podemos hablar o nos coartamos porque no es políticamente correcto. Pero al ser humano, a ustedes o a mí, al final de nuestros días, no se nos va a juzgar por criterios políticos. Se nos va a juzgar por criterios morales, éticos, por los valores eternos como la verdad o la compasión, que es lo que ha mantenido unida esta civilización. Y entonces serán juzgados ustedes y yo, al final de nuestros días, para analizar si hicimos lo correcto, si nos posicionamos directamente con nuestro corazón para intentar salvar vidas. Ustedes lo tienen en su mano. Miren dentro de ustedes, miren dentro de su corazón, pongan acción, salven vidas. Estos crímenes terribles no pueden quedar impunes en el silencio, en la oscuridad de las cárceles, de los campos concentrados en China, de trabajos terribles. No puede quedar impune. Está en su mano, está en su corazón y también está en su futuro cuando vayan a ser juzgados. Porque por encima de la justicia humana, aquellos que tenemos creencias, está la justicia superior, la que rige nuestras vidas. Y ahí no nos valdrán las excusas de lo que era políticamente correcto. Háganlo, tengan esa valentía, que puedan decir cuando llegue el momento, hice lo que debía hacer para salvar vidas y para hacer un mundo mejor. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Mr. Iglesias, for deeply touching us at the heart. You remind us that this is not just an abstract political human rights discussion, but that it is our responsibility to judge for ourselves about the evilness of forced organ harvesting. Next, I would like to welcome Representative Steve Chabot, a congressman from the United States of America. He is a staunch defender of human rights and has pushed forward legislation to combat forced organ harvesting and the persecution of Falun Gong. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Representative Steve Chabot.
I'm Steve Chabot, the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific. As a longtime supporter of the rights of Falun Gong practitioners, I'm pleased that you were able to host an event that calls attention to one of the most heinous human rights abuses occurring today, state-sponsored forced organ harvesting in the People's Republic of China. Wherever one looks, from the PRC's support of Russia during the war in Ukraine to its mercantilist trade policy, the Chinese Communist Party is challenging the free world and seeking to replace its values with Beijing's ideology. But perhaps the CCP's most fundamental challenge is in the area of human rights. From Hong Kong to Tibet, from the Great Firewall to the genocide in Xinjiang province against the Uyghurs, the litany of CCP crimes is too long to recount. The PRC's long-standing practice of state-sponsored forced organ harvesting is part and parcel of this inhumane regime ruling China. Over the past several years, especially with the release of the China Tribunal's final judgment, the evidence has become even more clear that the PRC is indeed engaged in this vile practice. And the scope and scale of organ harvesting in China is truly breathtaking. According to well-known estimates, 60 to 100,000 transplants occur each year, most of which are a result of forced organ harvesting. The principal source for these transplants have been unwilling Falun Gong practitioners. This despicable practice allows China to maintain a pretty much on-demand organ transplant regime, which is unheard of even in the most modern developed countries. In the face of such persecution, the number of Falun Gong practitioners has dwindled dramatically, and I'm afraid the CCP's next source of organs may be the Uyghurs. It's hard to fathom how truly evil this is, and hard to believe such depravity is possible. That's why events like this are so important, and why I'm honored to join you today to bring awareness to this unspeakable crime. As one of the most barbaric practices in human history, it's past time for real accountability for those who perpetuate forced organ harvesting. Today, right now, the civilized world must demand that China end this practice once and for all. China must be held accountable for this gross violation of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chabot, for your steadfast engagement in the field of human rights and your constant support in the fight against forced organ harvesting. Your commitment and energy to counter human rights violations is inspiring. Next, I would like to welcome Mrs. Teresa Chu, a renowned international human rights lawyer and co-initiator of the Universal Declaration on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting. Mrs. Chu will speak in Chinese, and you will find an English translation of her speech on the side panel. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Madame Teresa Chu.
大家好，我今天很荣幸来参加属于联合国人权委员会周边活动的这个非常重要的研讨会。2021年9月，联合国大会召开期间，来自于亚洲、美国、欧洲的5个非政府组织共同举办了反活摘的世界峰会。在世界峰会的最后一天，发表了打击和防治活摘器官的世界宣言。这份世界宣言是呼吁人们共同制止中共活摘器官的暴行，倡导各国来实践这份宣言的内容。同时呢，制定各国的刑事法律来严惩这个前所未有的邪恶暴行。在这个世界宣言之下，有一个法律委员会，我们律师起草了一份草案，将经由这5个非政府组织向国际社会推动刑事立法。今天我仅代表这个法律委员会来向各位报告这份草案的重要内容。首先，我们要谈为什么要在各个国家的层面上来推动刑事立法，来惩罚活摘器官的暴行。我们知道，在2006年，联合国禁止酷刑的委员会以及前酷刑问题特别报告员诺瓦克教授，对于中共强摘囚犯活体器官做移植的指控表示关注。当时就要求了中共政府必须针对中国的器官移植系统的透明度和问责制度必须要透明化，以及提高问责制度。但是中共政府在当时并不予以回应。到了2013年的12月9号，6个来自亚洲、美国、欧洲的人权律师和移植的医学专家，我们一起到了日内瓦，去向这个联合国的人权高专，当时的人权高专是 Lavi Pillay 女士，向她递交了在2013年从53个国家、全球5大洲收集到的150万个针对中共活摘法轮功学员器官的这个请愿书，要求人权高专做以下几件事情。 这份请愿书的内容，首先是要求人权高专要公开谴责中共政府对于中国移植系统滥用的怠忽，并且要求中共立即停止活摘法轮功学员的器官。第二点的话，我们认为人权高专必须要进一步调查活摘器官恶行的真相，以便作为将来起诉反人类暴行元凶的依据。第三个，应该要呼吁中共政府立刻停止迫害法轮功，因为镇压迫害法轮功是导致大规模的法轮功学员遭到杀害、遭到活摘器官的根本原因。在这个当时呢，我个人还特别向来接见我们的联合国人权高专办公室的2位联合国的官员，一位是律师，一位是中国问题专家。我告诉他，在中国大陆一直存在着大量秘密关押法轮功学员进行活摘器官的死亡集中营。这个死亡集中营遍布中国各个城市。我们希望人权高专要进一步查出死亡集中营的真相。当时这2位官员听了这段指控之后，并没有任何表示，只是沉默的、脸色凝重的记录着。时至今日，2022年，这些在国际社会上始终在关注中共活摘器官的个人、专家以及非政府组织，不愿意再眼睁睁地看着国际司法的怠惰及对国际暴行的不作为，因此决心要向世界各国来推动一份反活摘器官法。现在我来就跟大家扼要的介绍一下这份反活摘器官法的主要内容。第一点，关于活摘器官本身的定义。经过医学专家还有法律专家长期的调查的结果，我们把活摘器官罪定义为为了器官移植、医学用途或其他形式的用途，或者为了经济利益的目的，而以暴力或胁迫的手段强制摘取活人的人体器官或组织，从而导致被害人的重伤害或死亡的犯罪行为，称之为活摘器官。值得注意的是，器官贩运和非法摘取器官与活摘器官罪最大的不同点，就是活摘器官的犯罪特征，一个主要的特征就是从活人的身体、活人的人体身上强制的摘取器官或者是人体组织，从而造成被摘取人的重伤害及死亡。而这一点在器官贩运或非法摘取器官的法律上面并没有做如实的规定。接下来我们来谈一下哪些人的哪些行为构成活摘器官罪。任何人或组织如果实施了以下的任何一个行为，并且是故意或有理由相信这些行为将促使活摘器官的实施，我们认为都应该负起活摘器官的罪责。第一个，将被活摘之人体器官或组织移植到另外一个人体之内。第二个，储存或运输被活摘的人体器官或组织，或是将活人运送至将实施活摘器官的处所。第三个，管理或维护任何包含了人体器官或组织的相关活人医疗信息和数据库。第四个，操作或维护人体器官或组织摘取或移植手术的设施。第五个，操作或维护关押人员的设施，而这些关押设施里面的关押人员可能被活摘器官。第六个，接受该被活摘器官或人体组织的移植，也就是移植的接受者。第七个，从经营或管理器官移植当中直接或间接获得全部或部分的收益。 第8个，提供资金、医疗技术、医学培训、医护人员以及其他形式的医疗资源来实施活摘器官。第9个，将提供被活摘之器官或组织的个人或组织介绍给有潜在需求的个人或组织，这就一般所谓的转介。第10项，为获取经济利益而将提供被活摘器官和组织的个人或组织介绍给潜在需求的个人或组织，这个是一般所称的中介。第11个，为获取经济利益而以广告或其他的形式对其他的个人或组织进行宣导或招揽人体器官或组织的移植。此外，我们特别提出来，在宪法上的统治者、公职人员或者是军事上的指挥官，他命令指导下属实施活摘器官，或者是为适当的予以有效的管控而导致他的下属或其他个人实施活摘器官者，也应该要负起活摘器官的罪责。由于活摘器官是相当于反人类的严重罪行，在管辖权的方面，我们认为应该采取域外管辖。所谓的域外管辖，就是在本国的境内，任何本国人或者是外国人在境外的作为或不作为，如果触犯了本法草案的犯罪的时候，视为在本国境内的实施，一样要负起活摘器官的罪责。尤其活摘器官罪的追诉权没有时效上的限制。在刑事惩罚方面，我们呼吁世界各国依照各国的刑事法体系，对于活摘器官罪科以最严重的刑事惩罚，情节严重者应该处以无期徒刑或最高的法定刑。此外呢，我们对于参与活摘器官的医护人员，包括医生、护理师以及相关的人员，他们在从事他们的专业职务的时候实施活摘器官，他们除了要负起刑事责任之外，他们的职业资格应该予以取消或者撤销。对于犯罪嫌疑人，犯活摘器官罪的犯罪嫌疑人的行政制裁，应该不准其入境，或者发现在境内有这样子的犯罪嫌疑者，应该将其驱逐出境。此外，在防治活摘器官犯罪以及国际合作方面，本法呢草案中也提出了10项的规定，由于今天时间的关系，所以不予赘述。我今天所要讲的一个结论就是，活摘器官是一个特别残忍的大规模的屠杀之外，还作为了群体灭绝和种族灭绝的手段，是对人类的道德基础最根本、最残忍的摧毁。我必须要再次强调，我们面对国际司法到目前为止的懈怠以及不作为，每一个有良心的人，在国家的层面上，都应该尽量的利用所有民主和法律的手段来制止活摘器官犯罪。我们希望世界各国来参用法律委员会此次所提出的反活摘法的草案，发挥你们在各个国家立法体系的一个积极的作用，来制裁和吓阻犯罪。我们希望当有一天活摘器官的历史悲剧结束的时候，我们每个人都可以摸着自己的良心说，我为了制止活摘器官曾经努力过，我无愧于心。谢谢大家。
Thank you, Madam Chu. Your expertise and vision in the field of human rights is inspiring and deserves to be recognized by international legislators and parliaments. Your elaboration on the clear legal definition of forced organ harvesting is another milestone in the combat of this crime against humanity. Next, I would like to welcome Madame Annick Pontier, a member of the Belgian Parliament. Madame Pontier has continuously engaged in the battle against the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners and the horrors of forced organ harvesting, and has pushed this topic to the forefront of Belgium and international politics. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Madame Annick Pontier.
Good afternoon. It is an honor for me to speak to you today. As a member of the Belgian National Parliament and the Committee of Foreign Affairs, I focus on human rights in general and more specifically on the political situation in China. Forced organ harvesting, therefore, is a topic I ask a lot of attention for. Forced organ harvesting should get a lot more attention from both the media and policymakers because it constitutes an unmistakable crime against humanity. In my understanding, forced organ harvesting on living people has two main motivations. One is commercial, the other is political and ideological. And however cruel and wrong commercial organ trading may be, it is the second motivation that frightens us the most and on which I will focus today. The main perpetrator today, when it comes to politically driven organ harvesting, is without any doubt China. Beijing persecutes different groups on ideological and political grounds because their affiliation does not match the totalitarian communist state ideology that Xi Jinping wants to impose upon all citizens. This organ harvesting is part of a broader persecution system that the Chinese government uses to erase the religious, cultural, and philosophical identities of these different groups. Some would go as far as calling the Chinese persecution programs in which they use forced organ harvesting genocidal. How is this possible? How can a country in today's developed world that accepted the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights act so cruelly? The answer is quite simple. Chinese decision makers have a different conception of human rights than we do in the West. More so, they do not care about human rights at all and have no regard for human life if those lives don't further their internal communist agenda and their ambitions to become a global superpower. This way, a stance against China becomes a stance for human rights around the world. Because China doesn't mean to limit itself to what happens inside its own borders, it wants to exert influence all around the world and advance their totalitarian model. We should therefore strongly condemn these crimes against humanity in every possible way. That is why I strongly urge the UN to react against forced organ harvesting of living people. I thank you so much for your efforts in this domain.
Thank you, Madame Pontier, for reminding us of the Chinese government's lack of respect of the international treaties, even of those that it has signed and ratified, lack of abuse of extradition treaties to hunt down human rights victims that have escaped China. Now, I would like to welcome David Matas, an international human rights lawyer and expert in the domain of forced organ harvesting. He was one of the first legal experts who conducted the first systematic investigation on forced organ harvesting in 2006. Mr. Matas is determined to end these crimes against humanity. Today, he will review the United Nations reactions in the face of forced organ harvesting over the last 15 years. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. David Matas.
What are the solutions the United Nations offers to the mass killing of Falun Gong and other prisoners of conscience for their organs? To answer that question, I will go through 8 structures of the UN, both those which have attempted to provide a solution to this crime against humanity and those which have avoided doing so. The first 2 structures are the UN Rapporteur on Torture, then Manfred Nowak, and the UN Rapporteur on Religious Intolerance, then Asma Jahangir. These rapporteurs, in their 2007 and 2008 reports to the UN Human Rights Council, asked China to explain the discrepancy between the volume of transplants and the volume of identified sources. Professor Xi Bingyi, then vice chair of the China Medical Organ Transplant Association, indicated in March 2006 that China had done about 60,000 transplants in the 6-year period 2000 to 2005. The persecution of Falun Gong began in 1999. The Chinese government response to the rapporteurs stated that Professor Xi Bingyi expressly clarified that on no occasion had he made such a statement or given figures of this kind, and these allegations and the related figures are pure fabrication. Yet the official statement of Xi Bingyi remains accessible on the internet still today. Third structure, UN Committee Against Torture. China is a party to the Convention Against Torture. As a party, it is obligated to report periodically to the expert committee established under the convention. China has reported twice in 2008 and 2015, since it began the mass killing of prisoners of conscience for their organs. In both years, the expert committee, in its concluding observations, called on China to immediately conduct or commission an independent investigation into organ transplant abuse in China with prisoner of conscience victims. The fourth structure is the Universal Periodic Review. In the 2018 Universal Periodic Review for China, Germany asked these advanced questions. How does China react to allegations of organ harvesting in prisons and detention facilities? Can China provide data on annual numbers of organ transplantations and legal sources of organ donations in order to dispel these allegations? In the interactive dialogue part of the Universal Periodic Review for China, Austria said, regarding the removal of organs, we would like to know how the Chinese authorities ensure that this is only performed with free, informed, and specific consent of the donor without exception. Austria would be grateful to receive information on the implementation of a zero-tolerance policy on harvesting organs in prisons and detention facilities. The Chinese delegation, in response, stated that the transplantation of organs is regulated by strict provisions enacted in 2015, that China has an organ allocation system, and that the traceability of organs in China was affirmed by the World Health Organization. There are a number of flaws with this Chinese response. There was no law enacted in China about transplantation of organs in 2015, only a Chinese Communist Party Government of China policy statement. A 1984 Chinese law, unrepealed, allows the sourcing of organs from prisoners without their consent or the consent of their families, provided the bodies are unclaimed. The organ allocation system, the China Organ Transplant Registry system, is shrouded in secrecy. Its website shows nothing substantive. The statement of World Health Organization endorsement of the Chinese transplantation system is misleading. The World Health Organization does not engage in periodic public evaluation and critiques of country transplantation systems. The fifth structure is the UN Human Rights Council itself. At each UN Human Rights Council regular session, there's an agenda item titled Human Rights Situations that require the Council's attention. Not being a member of the Council prevents a state from voting at the Council, but not from speaking at the Council. Under this agenda item, any country, whether a member of the Council or not, can deliver an oral statement. Organ transplant abuse with prisoner of conscience victims should be a matter of continuing concern at every Human Rights Council session, raised by all human rights respecting countries. But that, unfortunately, has not been the case to date. Sixth structure, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. I and a delegation from Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting met in Geneva in December 2013 with the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to present a petition with nearly 1.5 million signatures from 53 countries and regions asking the High Commissioner, then Nabi Pillay, 1, to call upon the government of China to end immediately forced organ harvesting from Falun Gong prisoners, 2, to initiate an investigation which could lead to the prosecution of the perpetrators of this crime against humanity, and 3, to call upon the government of China to end immediately the brutal persecution of Falun Gong. One of the people in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights with whom we met suggested we contact the UN Office for Drugs and Crime in Geneva. Other than making that suggestion, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights did nothing in response to the petition. The High Commissioner herself, I noticed, is planning a visit to China in May this year. I and others have already suggested that she raise this issue, the mass killing of prisoners of conscience for their organs, on this visit. The seventh structure is the UN Office for Drugs and Crime. We followed up on the suggestion from the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to contact the UN Office for Drugs and Crime and asked them for a meeting in March 2014, to which they agreed. Shortly before we arrived, we were told that the meeting was no longer possible because we were busy. Having made our travel arrangements, we came anyways, and after we arrived, an official whom we contacted told us by email a meeting would not be productive as my section's work, and his section was the human trafficking, migrant smuggling section, does not include what you refer to as organ harvesting, nor the other issues covered in your email. The eighth and last structure I'll mention is the human rights experts of the UN Human Rights Council. 12 human rights experts, in a joint statement made in June 2021, less than a year ago, called on China promptly to respond to the allegations of organ harvesting and to allow independent monitoring by international human rights mechanisms. So that's my survey of these structures. In conclusion, I would say the UN is an opportunity. Human rights respecting governments and experts must take advantage of that opportunity and not turn the UN into an opportunity lost. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mates, for giving us a survey of past initiatives. There were many opportunities to respond to the crime of forced organ harvesting, yet not all of them resulted in clear action. This might be a wake-up call for the United Nations to stop forced organ harvesting in China, to defend and protect Chinese citizens and all citizens of the world. Next, I would like to introduce Mr. Peter van Dalen from Netherlands. Mr. van Dalen is a member of the European Parliament and is trying to bring the issue of forced organ harvesting back into the discussion at the European Parliament. He is looking to establish a strategy to stop these crimes. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Peter van Dalen.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Peter van Dalen. I'm a member of the European Parliament, and amidst the crisis in the Ukraine, we have to keep our eye on the other big offense of human rights in the world, which is the illegal forced harvesting of organs in China. I think it's very good that we keep pointing out to that really serious insult of human rights, the illegal organ harvesting, which is in itself devastating for the people whose organs are taken out, but also we have to remember the prisoners of conscience who are most of the time victim of this crime. What we see is that fortunately many organizations point out to this crime. The China Tribunal and the Doctors Against Organ Forced Harvesting, I'm really glad for their work, that they keep pointing out at this really grave situation. What should we do? Well, in the first place, I think it's really important that we raise the awareness on this issue. I do this here in the European Parliament, to raise the awareness on the issue. And furthermore, we should point out on every possibility we have what is going on and what can be done. Well, for instance, individuals in China who are committing those crimes should be targeted with sanctions. I think that is really important. And the European Union has now discussions with China on an investment agreement. This issue of the illegal organ harvesting should be on top of that agenda, on top of the agenda when we discuss trade relations with China. And furthermore, member states should reconsider their medical relations with China, because we know what is going on, and it is done by people with a medical examination, with a medical education. So we have to rethink what we are doing with China. And furthermore, let's keep up the awareness. I'm doing that here in the Parliament, you do it at your conference, and I wish you all the best. We have to point out to this great evil that is going on in China. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Dalen, for your determination to combat forced organ harvesting. Your voice is an inspiring and stands tall like a beacon. Next, I would like to welcome Mrs. Kaze Alves, a newly qualified British lawyer with a particular interest in human rights and the crimes of forced organ harvesting. As a representative of the next generation, her engagement is to subject this service respect and give us hope that there is a continuation in the fight against these unspeakable crimes against humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mrs. Kaze Alves.
The UN was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. This is a quote from a former UN Secretary General in 1954, less than 10 years after the formation of the United Nations. To him, the UN's role was clear: peacekeeping, protecting, and preventing the atrocities in this world created at the hands of man. And if you're attending this webinar today, I imagine you feel the same. The United Nations is formed on the basis of peace, dignity, and equality on a healthy planet. But today, with horrors beyond imagine and global crisis, we must accept that more needs to be done. Today, the world sees the pain and suffering, torture and murders of hundreds and thousands of Falun Gong practitioners in China by the Chinese Communist Party in a webbed network of state-organised organ harvesting. Today, we see the enforced disappearances of millions of human beings only because they chose to follow a spiritual practice of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. Today, we see crimes against humanity on a scale unfathomable. Yet today, we still remain silent. That is why I call on the United Nations to implement a three-step strategy to enhance transparency, accountability, and compliance with UN treaties, and to instigate investigations into the People's Republic of China to hold them accountable for crimes against humanity, torture, and breaches of international law. In 2018, the China Tribunal published an interim judgment confirming that it was certain, unanimously and beyond reasonable doubt, that forced organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience had been taking place in China for many, many years. And in 2019, the China Tribunal found that China had committed crimes against humanity against the Falun Gong population beyond reasonable doubt. They are not the only ones to recognise this. Many more organisations, activists and NGOs have also found China to be committing deliberate and systematic acts causing human suffering and death on a large scale. But despite these findings and the abundance of evidence and witness testimonies over the last 2 decades, little has been done by way of action. A contributing factor to this is the fact that crimes against humanity have not been codified in international law, and consequently there is no real mechanism through which the UN can bring action for such atrocities. Although crimes against humanity have been recognised and prosecuted for almost 80 years, they are only codified within the Rome Statute, and can therefore only be prosecuted before the International Criminal Court. As China is not party to this statute, it does not fall within the court's jurisdiction and so cannot be used to seek redress for China's ongoing abuses. This means that there is currently no mechanism by which China, or any country not party to the Rome Statute, can be held to account and punished for crimes against humanity. This leaves the obligation for mankind to address, prosecute, and prevent crimes against humanity largely without legal basis. It seems implausible that a country in the 21st century could be found guilty of mass murder, enslavement, and extermination, and there not be a way to legally challenge this. But it is true. This is a long-standing, potent gap in international law. Former UN Special Rapporteur for Torture expressed several years ago that there is a need for a treaty that establishes state responsibility for crimes against humanity. And former head of the UN Office for Legal Affairs stated that it is important to have a specific convention which will regulate all elements related to the interstate cooperation in fighting these crimes. A search of the topic on the UN webpage further shows that there have been efforts to bring this treaty to light, but it has yet to materialise. That is why today I call on the UN to introduce a convention against crimes against humanity. This new treaty would provide a tool for the UN to prosecute these crimes in a similar way to genocide, war crimes, and torture, allow for the introduction of international obligations on member states to prevent the crimes occurring, and address a harmful omission in international law. But that's not all. Falun Gong practitioners have faced tortures truly incomprehensible. They have been suspended from heights by handcuffs. They have been beaten with electric batons. They have been physically stretched with belts and force-fed with rigid tubes, losing teeth and suffering internal bleeding in the process. Some have faced force-feeding with salted and boiling water. They have experienced pain and suffering that knows no bounds, pain and suffering that makes the stomach turn and face grimace, to clutch your body and hope to never feel anything like it yourself. But it is a daily reality for these practitioners. In 2020, the China Tribunal reviewed the evidence over the last 20 years and concluded beyond reasonable doubt that acts of torture have occurred in China against Falun Gong practitioners. Despite this, and despite China having ratified the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment in October 1988, the UN has yet to trigger application of the Convention on China for their ongoing forced organ harvesting. As part of this convention, it is mandatory that all party countries submit a report to the UN every 4 years, setting out what measures they have taken in the prevention of torture and the protection of victims. In 2015, China submitted their report to the Board of Experts, who consequently raised concerns about China's refusal to provide data on the number of prisoners in detention centres, their treatment of human rights lawyers, and the superficiality of their anti-torture measures. In a meeting with the Chinese delegate in November 2015, they refused to answer the questions of the committee, stating instead that the word torture was difficult to translate into Chinese. All the while, many more hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives to this state-sanctioned abuse. Article 20 of the Convention Against Torture states that if the committee receives reliable information which appears to it to be well-founded, that torture is being systematically practiced in the territory of a state party, the committee shall invite that state party to cooperate in the examination of the information, and to this end to submit observations with regards to the information concerned. The UN have repeatedly called on China for several years to cooperate and respond to the allegations, and each year they have refused. The China Tribunal opened the door to China to provide evidence to rebut the allegations of forced organ harvesting, and they declined to do so. The world has called for answers, and China has remained silent. A UN Special Rapporteur once said that torture is the moral abyss of mankind. It is the sacrifice of our humanity on the altar of our fears. It is the total capitulation not only of our personal integrity, but it is the very end of civilization itself. Permitting China to continue torturing hundreds of thousands of Falun Gong practitioners on account of their failure to respond to calls of cooperation is nonsensical and rejects the very purpose of the UN and its intentions for a better world. It is now time for the UN to take action and trigger an application of the Convention Against Torture to condemn and punish China for the physical and psychological torture they carry out on innocent vigils every day for following a spiritual belief. Talking about torture doesn't help those who are being tortured. We must act, and we must do it now. There is a duty to humankind for those who have the power to take action to do so. However, whilst international measures are necessary to achieve change, they are a futile effort without an accompanying mechanism by which to assess their success. Previously, UN human rights experts have raised their concerns about forced organ harvesting in China and have called on China to promptly respond to allegations of organ harvesting, citing the lack of available data and information sharing systems as an obstacle for effective investigations and prosecutions. China has historically demonstrated an unwillingness to disclose data relating to organ transplants and will provide only an estimated annual figure with no statistical evidence, under the pretense that it is a state secret. Often, the figures that they do provide demonstrate clear discrepancies. For example, between 1977 and 2009, China recorded having carried out 120,000 transplants, but also recorded only 130 deceased organ donations in that same period. Between 1999 and 2004, China's transplant rates increased by over 230%, with no plausible explanation. Waiting times for a kidney transplant in China have dropped to a mere week, when, in the UK, the average waiting time for a kidney transplant is 3 years. That is why it is now necessary for the UN to introduce an annual transplant transparency statement, requiring each country to produce a statement to the UN disclosing the number of transplants carried out by each hospital in the country each year, specifying what organs have been transplanted. Additionally, the UN must initiate a requirement for all member states to disclose how many of their citizens have travelled internationally to receive an organ transplant, what organ they received, and what country they had the procedure in. The concept of UN treaties requiring data collection is certainly not new. In fact, the UN Small Arms Treaty does just that. In order to improve gun safety and reduce gun crime, the treaty requires states to collect data on who owns a firearm, what type of firearm, and what the licensing status is. China actually has a significant interest in this treaty and are currently one of its largest supporters and funders, having contributed almost $140,000 in 2022 alone. There are also plenty of domestic laws in force across Europe, Asia, and North America, which require data collection as a fundamental catalyst for measurability of its effectiveness. By introducing an annual statement requiring UN member states to disclose the number of transplants each hospital carries out per year, it will enhance transparency, ensure accountability, and protect the integrity of the UN and its ambitions in preventing human rights abuses. When asked in 2014 to allow for independent investigations into the allegations of forced organ harvesting, the Chinese Communist Party replied, "It is not time yet. I plead you to recognise that that time is now. This matter is not theoretical discourse. It is a reality. It is happening, and it is happening right now. China has been enabled to develop an illicit and lucrative international organ harvesting trade, and much of the world has remained in disbelief. It has been the perfect cover-up. A crime of such horrifying nature that humankind truly can't believe it's real. But it is, and it needs to be stopped. There remains to be a deluge of unanswered questions, but one thing remains clear. It is now time for the international community to recognise these crimes for what they are, crimes against all humanity, and to put measures into place to ensure that human rights are upheld universally across the globe. Thank you."
Thank you, Mrs. Alves, for sharing your unique view and suggestions. You take on the issue of forced organ harvesting with a fresh perspective. You showed us that it is not only important to listen to the views of the young generation, but also that the next generation is fully prepared to join the arena of human rights. Finally, I would like to welcome our last speaker, Madame Chu Chin Tian. She is the Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission in her country and has been directly involved in changing her country's human organ donation and transplant laws to protect her fellow citizens. Madame Tian will speak in Chinese, and you will find an English translation of her speech on the side panel. Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Madame Chu Chin Tian.
我是台湾中华民国的国家人权委员。台湾经历了50年的戒严统治，我们在争取自由、民主、人权的道路上，可以说是流血流汗，无数人入狱，甚至于牺牲生命。今天一步一脚印，累积了无数的心血。如今我们享有充分的言论自由。如今人权立国已经是台湾的国家政策。2006年，我担任立法委员。当法轮功的学员来向我陈情，说有活摘倒卖器官的事情，当时我非常的震惊，几乎不敢相信。因为我一直以为纳粹的恶行已经是人类罪恶的极致，我无法想象有比这个更丑陋、更惨绝人寰的恶行。结果我发现，活摘倒卖器官是透过国家力量系统性的侵犯人权。这个是超乎一般人想象、匪夷所思的违反人类罪。所以我在立法院11年，我不断的关心这个问题。除了我以外，我们台湾的许多民意代表、我们的政府单位、我们的社会各界也不断关心这个问题。2007年的时候，除了台湾的国会，还有16个地方的县市议会都通过了反对活摘倒卖器官的决议，这是正式决议进入会议记录。我在立法院经过很多年的努力，在2015年终于成功推动修法，就是对我们的人体器官移植条例修法，明文规定禁止器官移植旅游，而且呢，还进一步要求我们出国到任何国家进行海外的器官移植，回国之后一定要强制登录，登记第一，你到哪个国家、哪个医院、哪个医生进行什么样的器官移植，而且还有罚则。你如果没有强制登录的话，可以进行罚款。最后，我们更进一步成功的让我们的卫福部答应，如果不强制登录，如果不按照法律规定登录的话，我们的健保不给付他抗排斥药，这个他必须终身服用的药品呢，他必须自费取得。在这样子的一关又一关的不断的推进之下，现在所有的到海外器官移植的人回来都要公开透明的登录，而且还要上网。在这样子的把关之下呢，从此到中国去进行器官移植的人数就开始大幅降低。然后我们的政府就可以了解是哪个医生的病人最常到哪个国家去，哪个医院进行什么样的器官移植，所以这个就自然的形成了一个管控跟监督。那这几年呢，我们的政府更进一步的做了一个管控，就是只要是我们的国际组织经过调查发现涉嫌 在中国参与器官移植、盗卖活摘器官移植的中国医生，我们不准他入境。那而且还建立起某种名单。我觉得这个都是我们的国家距离中国这么近，我们的人在不知情的情况下非常容易到中国去进行器官移植，我们必须善尽把关的责任。这些我们正在逐步的建立起来，因为这是反人类罪，因为我们也必须保护我们的人民，不要让他犯下参与这个罪行的这个错误。2019年，在伦敦成立了一个由南斯拉夫国际法庭检察官担任主席的民间的独立的中国法庭，经过好几次的听证，然后呢，经过好几百项证据的论证，判定中国活摘器官的恶行仍然持续在发生，而且也认定这个是反人类罪。以我们在台湾，我们离中国这么近，我们跟中国的语言是相通的，我们都尽这么大的力量在防范我们的人民去中国做器官移植。我们非常清楚，在中国现在不论是维吾尔族、法轮功、异议人士，正在监狱里面，正在集中营里面哀嚎，他们随时都有被活摘器官的风险。整个世界不能无视于这样子的哀嚎，我们更不能够对这样的恶行默不作声。我们非常的清楚，活摘、盗卖人体器官，这是牵涉多么庞大的利益，所以这样的恶行不可能自动停止，因为利益之所趋，这样的恶行不但不停止，它还有可能扩散。我们很清楚，虽然国际社会对这个问题越来越关心，但是它可能转成地下化，它可能变成在表面上似乎符合国际的规范，但事实上所有的恶行一切到造就。所以我在这边恳请大家，我们国家的人体器官移植条例，请明文禁止器官移植旅游。台湾的强制登录的机制，也请大家参考，是不是可以纳入贵国的法律体系里面。最后我要在这边再一次拜托，我知道联合国非常多的人权专家也关心这个议题，也曾经讲话，也曾经发声，但是呢，台湾不是联合国的会员国，我们想加入联合国而不可的。我们对联合国非常非常的敬重，特别是联合国的人权委员会。我在这边拜托联合国的人权委，请组织活摘、盗卖人体器官移植的真相调查小组。至少我们要了解，我们应该去调查到底现在世界在这方面正在发生什么事情。我们要调查出真相，我们要发现问题，面对问题，才有办法解决这个问题，才有办法制止这样子的反人类、反人权的恶行。拜托大家。
Thank you, Mrs. Tian, for sharing your personal experiences and initiative with us. We hope that your talk will be an inspiration to the United Nations Human Rights Committee, the United Nations delegates, and the United Nations rapporteurs. Your examples show that it is possible to stop forced organ harvesting. This brings us to the end of today's very strong and positive speeches that bring force and energy to the United Nations High Commissioner, to the work of the United Nations rapporteurs and the United Nations delegates, whose role is to defend human rights and punish those that abuse of it. For those of you with burning questions on the subject treated today by our honored speakers, we will have to wait until tomorrow to ask them. We cordially invite you to attend our second side event to discuss and answer all your questions and how the international community can move forward to stop this crime to save humanity. Today's speeches will be available on the websites of CAP Liberté de Conscience and Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting. At tomorrow's event, we will dive deeper into solutions and action that can immediately be put into place by all nations to stop the destruction of all nations and all human beings. We hope you will attend our second event tomorrow by 2 p.m. I give now the floor to Dr. Harold King for the final words.
Thank you, Thierry. In this context, I would like to propose to support and ratify the Universal Declaration on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting as a means of uniting our voices against forced organ harvesting. Several hundred doctors, lawyers, politicians, and experts have already co-signed this universal document to move away from these crimes to save human dignity and the human race from destruction. You may learn more about the Universal Declaration on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting and today's speeches on the CAP Liberté de Conscience and Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting websites. Now, Mr. Thierry Val, President of CAP Liberté de Conscience, will conclude today's side event.
Thank you, Dr. Harold King. I also invite you to read and sign the Universal Declaration on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting. I hope that we will achieve our goal with this conference so that a constructive dialogue can begin. If we want to get out of this downward spiral, respect of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by all states is not an option, it is a duty. To conclude, thank all the speakers for the relevance and the precision of their interventions. I thank the technical teams for the realization and the diffusion of this conference. And finally, I thank you for having attended this conference, hoping to see you again tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.